Ooh, hello my friends. Long time no see. I'd come down with a case of the old swampitis recently, but after a few weeks of sweaty, snot-filled bed rest, I'm finally back in action, and I'm gonna show you 3 more exceptionally quick and easy bases you can make for your miniatures.
Swamp Rip Miniatures.
Now all of these bases are starting with the same basic ingredient, being this cork sheeting stuff, as it's super cheap and robust. And to make a start on our first style, which will be these desert bases, I'm just pulling some larger pieces apart slightly and gluing them down with some nice cracks between them to begin building up some dry, craggy terrain straight off the bat. I prefer my bases to have a bit of elevation rather than just being all boring and flat, so I layer up some more chunks of cork into little rock formations, just working to create a slightly more interesting profile overall. Once I'm happy with those, I begin gluing on some small rocks from a basin mixture to vary up the textures a little bit and help smooth over the transitions between the cork pieces. Not going too over the top with these though, as we want to keep some flat spots for our miniatures to stand on. Next up, I'm adding a bit more glue and scattering on some coarse sand, followed by a much finer sand mixture, as this will give a rougher texture to the surface of the cork, and again help with building those transitions from the rock formations to the floors. A few extra little details like some skulls or a rusty old container will go a long way for adding some extra interest to your bases, and you can vary these up depending on what miniatures you'll be adding. I'll be priming all these bases today using some regular old brush and primer, as it doesn't matter if it goes on a bit thick. And for the desert one, I'm starting with an ochre colour, as this should help our deserty colours pop a bit more. For the paint scheme itself though, I like to use a variety of pale browns and greys to start building up some rough and ready rocky textures on the ground first. Although we want to end up with a sandy colour towards the end, rocky environments are made up of a ton of different colours, so it's good to build up a nice varied foundation first. I tend to start with an almost full coverage coat of a mid-brown first, then I'll work through all my different browns and greys next, just tickling these on a bit randomly for a natural patina. I like adding each of my following colours whilst the previous coat is still wet, as this helps to get some nice blends without a great deal of effort. It doesn't matter if they kind of smudge together, because they're rocks, you know? They don't need to look perfect. Anyway, once you're happy you've got a nice varied rocky effect, chuck on a dark wash to help pull those colours together and add some definition in all the recessed sections. You don't want things to end up too dark though, so if your wash has gone on a bit heavy, just clean out and dry off your brush and use that to wick away any excess wash from the rocks. The next step in the paint job is where your sandy colours really come together. You just want to add a couple of layers of dry brushing using a desert yellow colour first, and then a bony sandy colour after that, used more sparingly. Be careful that you don't go too over the top with these layers, as you still want some of your colour variants to poke through. And then finally, just paint in whatever little details you added to the base. Go for your classic bone colours if you've added some skulls and whatnot, and maybe a nice beaten up red for stuff like this container, just for a nice pop of contrast. Those are looking pretty good now, so to finish them off completely, I just like to add a couple of little grass tufts in this kind of beige dry grass colour, using them very sparingly again, since the desert is not a massively hospitable environment for plant growth. You could also use desert plants like this aloe stuff too if you have any, but mine felt a bit out of proportion with these bases, so I left them off this time. At this point you can definitely call the bases done, as they look pretty good, but I like to go one step further with some pigment powders just to pump up that dustiness one step further. I focus these mainly on the flatter portions of the ground so I can keep a bit of colour variance in the rocky recesses still, and once you've done that, give your bases their mandatory rim job and they are good to go. I think these desert bases could work really well for some Talon Desert Raiders, some Dry World Tyranids, or maybe something a bit more apocalyptic like Necromunda or Fallout miniatures, but what do you guys think? What would you stick on these bad boys? The next base I have for your beady little eyes today is the Rubble or City Ruins base, and of all the quick and easy bases, this might just be the quickest and the easiest. I start by adding our mandatory cork sheeting for the first layer of ground, and on top of that I carve a few little chunks of foam into some miscellaneous rubble sections. A section of broken wall with a window cutout is a good shout, but really any generic rubble shapes will do here. I prefer to use XPS foam for this instead of the cork, as it has a better texture and it's just a bit easier to get the shapes you want. I gave the XPS foam a quick touch of paint as I don't have any foam safe super glue at the moment, and the layer of paint allowed me to glue on my next details without melting it, and the details themselves don't need to be anything fancy. I just like to add little generic shapes that you might expect to see in ruined buildings, like some little styrene pipes, metal beams, and bits of wire acting as rebar from the pieces of rubble. Add whatever you think fits the vibe here, but you can't go wrong with some different styrene rods and pieces of wire. Once I got my details into their positions, I like to add a little bit more rubble, using some cork this time to add a bit of texture variety compared to the foam, and I'm mainly adding these around the edges of our rubble sections to help create some rubbly transitions. I cut a little hole here by this pipe so I can add a dirty old puddle later as an extra detail, and then my final bit of building work on this base is just using a bit more coarse sand to pump up the texture and add to those transitions. Easy peasy. This base gets a priming in grey as the majority of the rubble colours will be some sort of grey derivative, and then my first step in the actual paint scheme is just going over the primer with another medium to dark grey to give our base layer. After that, I'm just going through a few layers of dry brushing using a slightly lighter grey colour each time, and I'm not going too heavy with this, just looking to pick out the texture on our bits of rubble and ground. The final dry brushing layer is a slightly more beigey stone colour, which I'm using very sparingly to add a bit more variation into our colour palette. And to take that variation even further, I like to use a few different coloured washes splashed around the place, usually black, brown and green ones, as these pair up well together to create some nice natural shades in the recessed areas. Make sure to allow each wash to dry fully before adding the next to maintain a bit of separation in the colour, and again, use a clean brush to wick away any excess. I top up my dry brushing again when all the washes are dry, just picking out those raised textures once more, and then it's time for the metallic details. These don't need a great deal of attention really, just enough to help them pop and add a bit of contrast against the rubble. So for this, I base coat them with a dark metallic colour first, follow this with a dark brown wash for added depth, then give it a bit of a rust treatment. I use dirty down rust to add a nice dark foundation layer of rust, and then another dry rust effect paint on top of that for some brighter pops of orange. You can use regular old browns and oranges instead if you don't have any rust effect paints, but just make sure to finish everything off with some little chips of a shiny metallic colour. If you added a hole for your puddle, this AK interactive puddle effect stuff is really easy to use. Just add a couple of drops, let it set fully, then decide if you need another layer. But if not, just give your bases a good old fashioned rim job and let them be on their way. Like I said, super quick and so easy that even my dog could make these, if I had one. For some reason my mind always goes to Blood Angels when I see these bases, but they'd work well for a whole load of your regular old 40k forces and could even be used for some more realistic wargames. But yeah, who do you see standing on them? The third and final base for today's video is probably my favourite one overall, being this nice frozen icy snow base. And to start with, you guessed it, we're using some cork sheets to build up some rocky layers to give the base a more interesting profile. You can use a sculpting tool to scratch away any of the harsher edges of the cork sheet if you want to give these a slightly more natural appearance, and that's really the only building work required for these bases. Most of the magic happens in the painting phases. I like to prime these bases in white first, as I will be using a lot of pale and bright colours, and it just makes it a lot easier to get good coverage. So once you've got a nice thick layer of that pop in, we can make a start on our rocks. If you're watching this video, it's quite likely that you already have your own scheme for painting rocks, but if not, you can just do a really easy effect by giving them a mid-grey colour all over to start with, then kind of stippling and blending in some lighter grey colours on top of that. I'm doing this in much the same way I did the desert rocks, adding the subsequent layers on top of the previous ones whilst they're still wet to get some little blendy bits, but really you could just dry brush these too, which would be even easier. I like to come to a kind of pale bluey grey colour at the end, as these tones work well with the snow and icy colours we'll be adding, so use something like rust grey or Fenrisian grey if you can. To finish the rocks off as well, I like to add a tiny bit of Nuln Oil into the recesses to darken those down a bit, and now it's time for the icy section. I like to go for quite a vibrant blue colour under the ice, and you can do this in a number of different ways, but for my method, I start by base coating the whole thing with something like Thousand Suns blue first. Next, I'll build up a bit of a bluey green colour on the inner portion of our ice by first stippling on some Cyberite green, and while that's still wet, doing the same thing with something brighter like a Baharov blue colour to get an easy little blend. Repeat this a few times until you're happy, and maybe use a clean brush to blend them together a bit more neatly. Don't worry if it's a bit patchy though, as that will just help the ice to look more realistic once we finish anyway. After that, I'm glazing on a few layers of a fluorescent blue paint, mainly just because it's really vibrant and is already basically a glaze consistency, but you can use a regular blue paint if you like, just make sure to keep it very thin. In this step, I'm basically just trying to add a bit more icy color variation to our previous layer and pump up that saturation slightly. The penultimate step in the painting is to add some very pale blue colors to create a bit of a color transition around the edges of the ice, and it's good to build this up in thin layers too, but you don't need to do a glaze consistency like the last layer, and I'll also do a tiny bit of an off-white color around the edges to push this effect even further. Then finally, use that same off-white color to just add some little scratchy bits on the surface of the ice, trying to keep these as thin, straight and randomly placed as possible. You can skip this step if you like, but I think it does add a nice little effect to make the ice look more realistic. Now your ice should be looking something like this, which is decent enough already, but to make it look even better, we want a bit of a three-dimensional touch to it. I like to use this trusty AK still water effect for this. You can use resin and all sorts of other stuff, but just for ease of use, this is definitely my preferred choice. One layer looks good, but two is even better for a slightly thicker ice layer. And I was being a bit impatient, so I dried the second layer with a hairdryer, causing some of these little fissures from the heat, which in this case kind of actually worked for making the ice look more natural. But if you want your ice to be completely nice and smooth, then just let each layer set overnight. For your snow, I would honestly just recommend picking up some products like these AK ones. I'm not sponsored by AK, by the way, I'm just a big fan of their products. You can try homemade concoctions if you like, but I find that they tend to yellow over time and end up looking a bit naff, so definitely go for some of these if you can. I like to use this diorama snow stuff on top of the rocks first, as it's nice and thick, while this snow sprinkle stuff I use mainly around the edges of the ice, as it has a slightly thinner, kind of slushy, icy appearance to it once it dries. The final touch to the snow is some snowy micro balloons. Who the knows why they're called that, but I scatter those on top of the thicker snow stuff, as it gives it a much more natural, powdery snow texture that looks great when everything dries. If you're not completely satisfied with your first layer, just add another one, and when you are happy, you can also add some little grass tufts poking through the snow just to break it up a bit. Much like the desert bases, it's important to use a kind of dead looking grass tuft here, as it helps everything to look a bit more natural. And boom, the final of our three quick and easy bases. I can definitely see these ones being used for something like Space Wolves, but I'd probably chuck anything on them personally, as I just love how the icy blues look paired up with the snow, and yeah, they're probably one of my favorite bases overall. But there we have it, my friends, another basing video for you to get your chops round. Let me know which of these three is your favorite, and also let me know what your favorite random basing material is, as I'm always excited to pick up new supplies. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe or leave a like or a comment. It feels really good to be back after being filled up with snot and gunk for so long, and I'm excited for all the creations to come. As always though, I have been your friendly neighborhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.